Hello, I'm Jacqueline Holstead, and you are listening to On Point Conversations. In this podcast series, we share creative marketing, content, and branding strategies that help your business successfully navigate the new normal marketing environment. And I am Jacqueline Holstead, and I'm going to be talking to you today in my podcast about the rethinking process. And today I want to concentrate on developing your learning organization. I rarely ever walk into a new client, and of course this isn't the first question. There's a lot more that goes into discussions and things when you get into a new client. But one of the things that I like to learn early on, and not necessarily by asking the question directly, because I don't think I've heard anybody ever say, no, we're not a learning organization. But I like to learn early on if this is in fact a learning organization. Because my preference is to work with learning organizations, because they're the organizations that are willing to take challenges. They're willing to add things. They're willing to look at their processes and systems, which is what I do also, with a very crucial and critical eye to see, is this in fact working? Isn't it working? And sometimes the very people who define those processes and systems are the people I'm talking to. And as we talked earlier in my podcast, change is very difficult. So I'm also still going through the book called Think Again by Adam Grant. It's a good book if you want to read it. I'm sure maybe you can find it at your library even, or maybe you would like to read it. But I'm going to go through some things here and also my own experience in developing a learning organization. And definitely within the next 20 minutes, which is usually what my podcasts are, you're not going to get every tool necessary for a learning organization. You're going to get the beginning tools. So in his book, Adam Grant's book, he states early on, psychologists find that admitting we were wrong doesn't make us look less competent. It's a display of honesty and a willingness to learn. Now, I talked previously about how business owners can do and get into that rethinking process by thinking more like a scientist. And there are scientists who believe it's going to damage their reputation to admit that their studies failed to replicate. But really, the reverse is true. What they found with studies is they're judged more favorably if they acknowledge the new data rather than deny it. After all, it doesn't matter whose fault it is that something is broken if it's your responsibility to fix it. That's one of the quotes from Will Smith. Taking responsibility is taking your power back. So I know as leaders, when I work with leaders, there's often this thought that if I show that I have made a mistake, or that perhaps our process has a mistake in, that it might show that I'm less competent or confident or able. But again, as a psychologist show and as things show, it doesn't do that to your reputation. Now let's talk about and go back to how we create thinking organizations. And it's not simple to do. As I said, when I walk into clients for the first time, I'm going to be asking a lot of questions and I'm getting ideas, and they're giving me a lot of data because they want to get me up to speed quickly on their organization so we can go forward more quickly on strategies and marketing and content. But I want to know that this organization is a learning organization. And if it's not, I want to be able to talk to them about creating a learning organization. It's a way that we rethink the processes and we make it a process that works. Now, you might start, if you haven't done this already, with what I call project recaps. We used to call them postmortems, but the project isn't dead. The project may be continuing. It's a time to go through and say, okay, it's fresh in our minds what worked in the project that we just got done doing. It's fresh in our minds what worked, what didn't work. And it's now time to look critically at this. How might we have speeded up the process? How might we have gotten a better result? And it is, in fact, a looking back, kind of like your crystal ball, or also looking back what they might call Monday night quarterbacking. So you're not looking at it as just a way to critique what was done before. You're looking at it a way to learn from those kinds of issues and things that you bring up. One of the things that I hear organizations say, and it's kind of a little bit of a prickly area, is we use best practices. And when I hear that, I think of the really more old, staid organizations who are looking at the best practice principles. But I'd like you to consider abandoning best practices. Okay, before you fall off your chair or you say, oh no, we can't do that. Best practices suggest that the ideal routine, habits, systems, processes are already in place. But if we want people to keep rethinking the way they work, we're better off developing a process of process accountability and continually striving for better practices. And by process accountability, what I mean is looking at the process critically. There are always steps to processes and systems. And those steps, well, we don't want to maybe throw out the whole process and system, and maybe we do, but maybe we don't. We're going to fix and tweak things that don't work. So again, it's being able to, even if it's just in your mind, saying, we've always done it this way. We've always talked about this being the best practice, but now what we want to do is really make best practices as we move along, as we go forward. Also, in creating a learning organization, there really needs to be an established psychological safety. Now, what do I mean by that? So in learning cultures, people, your team members, whatever status they are, wherever they fall in the organization, they have to feel comfortable that they can question and challenge the status quo without being punished, without being fired, without being reprimanded. Because psychologically, safety often starts with the leader who's willing to role model humility. Some of the best companies that I've worked with who are the most successful are when the leader's willing to make the declaration that they have made a mistake, or they make a declaration that we need to make some changes. And here's some of the ideas, but they also take into account their team, their leadership, their people in the company who are going to know how those processes and systems work from the ground up. And they're going to want to know that they can be open and honest and challenge. They're also going to want to know that just because they challenge something doesn't mean that it's going to be changed. But we want them, and just team members and as people in our organization, we want them to feel safe. We want them to feel safe in the idea that they can present and question and challenge the status quo. Now, as we're doing that, we want to create an atmosphere not only of psychological safety, but of also actual safety. And we want to show them and model them ways to challenge the status quo and question it in professional ways. Now, let's not get into, I don't want to get too political here, but let's not get into the political realm where we're using rhetoric to create dramatic experiences that are really not necessary. Let's stick with the points and the facts. And we can bring feelings in, by the way. I don't want to negate feelings because they are a part of the change process. They are a part of just us as human beings. And we can state that we're frustrated about something. We can state that we don't understand. We can state that we don't even care about that particular thing. We can state that in a safe environment, but we have to understand that we may or may not have our changes made, or we may or may not have our frustrations met because we're all individuals and we all work together. The third part of creating a learning organization is keeping a rethinking scorecard. Now that comes in the book that Adam Grant did, and I thought that was really interesting because we don't evaluate then the decisions solely on results. I mean, it's nice when you get good results, and it's hard when you don't get good results. But we want to track how thoroughly different options are considered in the process. It's sort of like when I use Audacity to record my podcasts, and sometimes I want to change something. I want to look at how do I do a little bit of a vocal difference or a loudness difference or an amplifying difference or an effect. And I will make that change and I will record it and I'll make a copy of it. And then I'll go back and see and compare the two. That allows me to see the difference. So I want you to think about evaluating decisions in ways other than something that's just results driven. Because even a very bad process can have a good outcome. That's called luck. And a good process with a bad outcome might be considered a smart experiment because you're trying things. Learning organizations also have this kind of culture coming from the top down. So as a manager or team leader, you may not be at the very top or the C-suite. So you have to evaluate, is the C-suite, in other words, the president or the executives, are they on board to be a learning organization? You might even evaluate that before you take a position in that company, because doing it and having that kind of learning organization is a very valuable process for everyone. The other thing you can do, and I've done this in groups, we've talked about it's not really a game, but we talk about myth busting. We have a myth busting discussion. It's kind of a tongue twister, but it's kind of a thing where we talk about what we've got in maybe our process or a system or in something we do that we all think is working. And is that true or false? It's kind of a funny way to put it, but sometimes that puts people at ease to say, oh, I can make this change to this process, or I can discuss it. Just because we discuss this change, by the way, too, in a system process, doesn't mean we're going to implement it right away. We might want to look at how does that work within the whole other parts of the systems and processes, and how does that affect other teams, and how does that affect other people in our company. Another thing you can do is have in your redraft or in your final project meeting is a time, yes, to talk about what worked and what didn't, but also to talk about how those might be changed in the next process, the next system, the next project. So rather than being quite so focused on what worked and what didn't, which is good, I think you should get that out first. That's kind of your first thing. We'll look at what didn't work and why didn't it work and what are we going to do differently next time, even to the point of looking what worked and why did it work this time, and should we do the same thing next time or should we do something else? And again, if you can keep a record of these, kind of a record of your steps and processes, you'll be able to evaluate whether that worked or didn't. Sort of like you do an experiment. If you've done science before, you put in certain variables, you work in those variables, and then you change it. Now, I don't want you to feel like a learning organization is not a substantial organization. It definitely is, because it's a way for everyone to make changes as necessary, not to make a change just because there's a new person in town, or just because there's a new person at the top, or just because there's a new manager who comes in and wants to put their particular stamp on things. It's a way to have a culture that is open to learning more, and a culture that's open to looking. And lots of times you'll find companies who are not looking that way. They might not be evaluating the competition. For example, some very large companies have had very small competition. They've considered them to be small and out there, and that competition has grown and grown and grown under the eyes of the other organization, the larger organization, and taken bits and pieces until all of a sudden they're taking a big bite out of business. And the company acts like they never had any idea what was happening. So it helps to have that learning environment be open to outside of the company also. Who's out there? What are your competition doing? What happens if you go to a trade show or whatever? Learn more and see more about what's happening in the marketplace. Keep those things open. That's another way a learning organization can keep on top of what's happening around them. I appreciate your time. I know this doesn't make you a learning organization by just incorporating these, because it's a mindset and it's a culture and it takes time. But I hope it helped you. I look forward to doing more podcasts. I try to do one every week. I look forward to your listening. And again, I'm at onpointthinking.com. I have a contact page. I do look at the emails that come through from there. And if you'd like me to call you, you can put your phone number in, or if you'd like me to address a certain issue, feel free to put that question in or that comment. Thank you so much and have a really good day. Thank you for listening, and I invite you to join me next week as we talk more about specific actions you can take to reach your own business goals. You can find my library of other inspiring podcasts like this one at onpointthinking.com. Again, thank you for listening. This is Jacqueline Holstead at On Point Conversations.